Hello, everybody, and welcome to kind of our second trip down the road in this series of talking to folks that we work with here at Vectura. As everybody knows, on the line today, my name is Bart Schulman. I am the Chief Commercial Officer of Vectura. I have with me today Dan Bergin. Dan has just recently joined us and is going to, head up our intelligence investigations and recovery teams. And we're really looking forward to his vast background and knowledge to, elevate us to a new level. With that, Dan, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Bergin. Just recently retired back in 2025 from the New Jersey State Police. I spent a little over 27 years there. I'd characterize it as definitely one of the best experiences of my life. I got to serve alongside really good professionals who contributed a lot to various public safety initiatives throughout the state. I started my career like all New Jersey State troopers do as a road duty trooper, where it gives you a real good background in patrol, response, community interaction, things like that. After a few years, I was very fortunate. I became an academy instructor. I spent about 18 months training pre-service recruits in all sorts of basic police practice and procedure, getting the next generation of troopers ready to serve in New Jersey. My lifelong goal as a law enforcement officer, though, was to be in investigations. And after about 7 years or so, I made a move into investigative assignment, and I started as a street gang detective. And at the time in New Jersey, it was a really emerging concern with the drugs, the violence, everything else. And they're really starting to organize and become a pretty good criminal threat. And that intrigued me. And I was fortunate enough to go over there. And that started my my journey into learning about investigations and becoming a detective. From there, I spent the bulk of my career in that world and had a lot of different opportunities and specialized units and moved through the ranks of some leadership roles, but worked on intelligence operations, narcotics investigations, weapons trafficking, organized crime cases, public corruption, and of course, what we're going to talk about today, cargo theft. I was able to be involved and around all kinds of extensive, complex, multi-agency investigations that really focused on a couple of things: intelligence operations, field operations, partnerships, things that really mattered to make those cases move forward. I ultimately retired as a captain. I was it was like a dream come true because I was able to oversee some of the real high-level investigative enforcement initiatives that state police were responsible for. Some of the most serious criminal threats in the state, the gangs, organized crime, weapons trafficking, auto theft, things that were really making an impact. So that was a really, really nice way to kind of finish my career. My last year or so, I took an admin role as a captain, overseeing our records bureau and just statewide compliance with respect to records and criminal justice data systems and things like that. But the nice thing about, like I said, it was one of the highlights of my life was being a trooper. I was around a lot of people and I learned a lot of lessons about things that really matter in life, right? And whatever your career is, it was things like strategic leadership, operational excellence, having a commitment to something. In my case, it was public safety, and really learned a lot about collaboration and partnerships across the boards, both with public sector entities, other law enforcement organizations, and the private sector. So it was a real wonderful experience. And now I'm in the next chapter of my life with Vectura, and I'm really looking forward to the things to come here.
That's good. Yeah, great description, and we're fortunate. When you start to list off all the history, we're really fortunate to have you on the team. So, welcome, and I really appreciate all your experience. What I also find interesting is, and I want to thank you as well. Serving the public is a really, really tough job, and especially in this climate, sometimes thankless. And I really do appreciate law enforcement in general and the service that they provide. In the worst of times for most people. So it's not an easy job. So, when we talked and met a month or so ago or 2 months ago, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it doesn't really matter. When we met, we talked a bit about, the importance, for Vectura to have someone with, the skill set that you have, but also the organizational skills and other things associated with it that are critical for what we do. Tell me a little bit about, kind of that leadership, organization, startup mentality that you kind of shared with me about your past as well.
So I was always fortunate to be a part of something new. Throughout my career, there were initiatives, there were organizational reorganizations where we were building something new, and I was able to be selected to some of them and see things from the ground up, where we literally had no playbook, no predecessor unit to look at, really nothing else to serve as a benchmark, and we were able to go out and create those things and build the playbook, build the SOPs, discover the best practices, and move those things forward into fully operational units or initiatives for the state police. So it was something that I really aligned with. I really enjoyed that part of it. And to be a part of something now with Vectura is, for me, I think it's a really good fit because it aligns with the things that I like to do, to find new ways to do things, to challenge the status quo, and to identify opportunities to make a difference. And that's what kind of really motivated me to come on board with you guys.
Yeah, I said before we started talking to, there's no wrong answer, but that might be the most right answer I've ever heard. So I appreciate that. That was, I think in this climate of cargo crime, and I'll let you talk a little bit about your experience specifically around that. But in this era, it's always evolving. My last conversation with Curtis Salisbury was really about, how much is changing, what's going on that's different. So we need somebody like you that's thinking in different ways and not willing to stand for the status quo, wants to find a better mousetrap or whatever term you want to use, but also be very nimble and be able to change and turn and pivot, just like the criminal element is today. So with that, Dan, tell us a little about your specific cargo crime experience or a case or anything, whatever comes to mind that you want to talk about.
Sure. As I said, I was able to move through various leadership roles and really kind of fell into my lap. Like I said, I was focused a lot on that gangs, organized crime, narcotics type world. A promotion opportunity came up, and it landed me in our cargo theft unit, which was really new to me. I didn't have experience in it. I knew other people who were a part of it. And I really quickly learned that that was always an outside thing. I didn't really know what they did. So then to be able to go over to it and see firsthand and embed myself in it, it became really, truly one of the highlights of my career. I spent about 5 or 6 years there. I was lieutenant overseeing the unit, and things that were really important there. Well, first of all, the New Jersey State Police is one of only a handful of units that specialize in cargo theft across the country. So that was really unique for us. I spent about 5 or 6 years there. We focused very, very heavily on our public and private sector partnerships, which you'll probably hear me say that term a lot. That was something that carried over from my past experience, and I'll definitely bring it forward in this experience here. It's that partnership that matters. We were very focused on intelligence-driven operations, looking at what was happening in the past, trying to anticipate what would happen in the future. We were very lucky because we had the assets, we had the personnel, we had the training, we had the experience to conduct those major conspiracy type investigations that specialized in cargo theft in all of its forms. Like I said, we were one of only a few units across the country that had that luxury. So that's a challenge that law enforcement faces, because not every state police agency or county or federal agency has a dedicated group of people that really focus on that. Sometimes the thought pattern out there is, oh, theft is theft. And, whether you steal a car or you move major cargo through a shadow economy, they're not necessarily the same two things. And so that's where the state police, in my experience, had a lot of, and some of the other units out there across the country are able to focus on those conspiracy-based cases. A case that really struck out to me in my time there, it started in late October 2017 through 2018. And it was an organized cargo theft case where there was fencing operation, multiple individuals involved. But the thing that stuck out about this particular case, and this was a group effort led by a detective. I was fortunate to oversee the unit at the time, but we had a small group of detectives that were really highly motivated. They had all the tools they needed, which is rare in law enforcement, right? They want to do it sometimes, but they're spread out in 1,000 different directions. So this one, the trigger event for this, it was a tractor trailer stolen. It had approximately $104,000 worth of meat stolen. So we would always pay attention to stuff that got stolen and not necessarily investigate it, because that would be the local jurisdictions. Their main focus would be to investigate the theft. But we would always pay attention to it because, as cargo theft goes, the theft location is one spot, and within minutes it's in another jurisdiction. So That's just the reality of the way it works. But that was a single theft event. The trailer was ultimately located. That was stolen out of a truck yard, but the trailer was ultimately located a few days later at a service area, and So a lot of times that's where the story ends with law enforcement, right? Theft happens, reports taken, maybe the trailer's located empty, maybe it's not. So that's where the story usually ends. But like I said, we were fortunate to have the infrastructure in place as a unit to further that case. So what the guys did, they basically went back and backtracked that case from initial theft to recovery of the trailer. They were able to use some investigative techniques and canvases and intelligence checks and different things. But very quickly thereafter, they were able to identify a fencing location. There was a warehouse located within a probably hour or so drive of where the initial theft was, and also where the trailer was recovered. So there were similar methodologies happening across the state at the time, but whether they're related or not, no one really truly knows at that point. But we're able to, at the conclusion of the case, we realized that there were 16 separate cargo thefts that tied into this particular crew. And those 16 thefts were from 10 different companies. So, and that came all to basically one warehouse location. And that was in the northern part of New Jersey. There was a primary hub. But like I said, a lot of those cases end when the recovery of the empty trailer happens. We were able to go out, do extensive surveillance on this warehouse, see the things and the indicators to realize that this is not a regular legally operating warehouse. There were indicators of criminal activity there, with the methods and means by which vehicles were showing up, offloading, different hours of the night. No traditional checks and balances. A truck would just roll up, the back would pop open, they'd offload materials. But anyway, they built the case to the point where we realized this was a location that was definitely involved in some type of warehousing or fencing. So there were two smaller secondary locations that we identified, but in the end of it, we were able to execute search warrants. And at that point in time, we were able to recover, I think it was a little over $1 million worth of goods from those 10 different victim companies. And right there, you had that first initial victim company, right? The one that lost the stolen meat. They had technologies and things in place that allowed our guys and the cooperation to be able to then to follow that through. So it ended up being a real success, because not only did we recover some things for our original victim, but we found victims that were yet known to the police, that in some of them, and in some instances, didn't even know they had been victimized. We reported their thefts to them. So that was a really nice thing. It ended up, it was a organization that had about 11 people that were arrested at the time when it was taken down. They were charged with the various types of crimes that you would think that they would be charged with. But the thing that was really significant about that, and it was an ongoing theft cycle. These people were doing this for a long time before we were able to discover them with that one left behind trailer. It was a multi-agency cooperation, right? Every single jurisdiction had a different lead police agency for the initial thefts. We led it from the warehousing and fencing piece, but it was intelligence driven. It was heavily relied upon, like I talked about earlier, that public and private sector partnership. Police and private sector, they can't operate in silos, and sometimes that does happen. We, in my experience, always tried to bridge that gap and bring those two together. And that's what made this case a success, because we had that support, we had that buy-in from the private sector, and we also had the ability, as a law enforcement agency, to do that kind of case. And it had a real nice impact. One of the things when you do a case like that, right, especially in a particular geographic area that might be a little bit prone to cargo theft, if you want to call it that, when you have those types of cases and you have that type of impact, in this case, cargo theft settled right down for a little bit. So it not only does a recovery, it not only like helps a victim out, get some of their merchandise back, but it also has a preventative effect longer term. And that may vary. It's not always the case, but in my experience, it does have a dampening effect on the immediate moving forward activity of cargo theft.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, having that kind of the ability to go through that long investigative process to find an answer. But it was the one theft that had a little more technology associated with it and other things that allowed you to backtrack into the other ones and get a good idea. I think it's pretty fascinating that when I got into this industry a bit ago, I never knew this was going on at all. That's kind of the funny thing to me. It's like this big hidden secret that cargo theft exists in a lot of ways. Now, over the past couple of years, it's been on 60 Minutes, other places. But, back when you were doing all this hard work, it was just like in the shadows. And it's also not surprising that the other thefts were reported. A lot of this goes unreported. We talk about that, at our conferences and other things all the time about the fact that, we can come up with cargo theft numbers. They're going to be inaccurate because there's so much that's unreported or unknown. I mean, there's some of that too. Hey, I didn't even know we were missing those. Thank you. Thanks for finding them for us. So that's kind of a funny part of the story.
That happened a lot with us, because we would always execute a search warrant on a warehouse somewhere, and for whatever we were looking for, and then we'd find 3 other things that we weren't looking for. So it was a win-win-win, and there were victims out there that were made whole because of another victim. So it worked out. And like I said, it really comes down to that partnership, and it comes down to being able to understand for both sides, the law enforcement side and the private sector side, to be able to understand how both sides talk and how both sides operate, and what's important to law enforcement might not be important to the private sector, and vice versa. And it's finding that balance and working in that space that matters the most to make it successful.
Yeah, that's for sure. I mean, fundamentally, they're on the same side, but they're not, right? A lot of people don't want people to know their stuff gets stolen, or the trucking company doesn't want to know the stuff's getting stolen because it tarnishes their name. But at some point we've got to really start attacking the problem holistically, and that's going to be from people being more open, and but it's on folks like us to make that opening less scary, so we can actually help them find something. I think the other interesting part you brought up in that kind of story about the investigation and so forth is, we talked today about much more strategic theft. Well, to me, the reason you slowed down theft in that area is that was a very strategic theft. They had a warehouse. They had all these things in place to distribute the goods once they're stolen. So there's a plan. This was a company. This wasn't just some guy out stealing stuff. So, that's the other mental shift that a lot of people have to make. And I think people are making it now, but it's the shift from, it's these bandits out there stealing stuff to this is actually a business for these people. They're running it like a business. So therefore, if we're running it like a business, how do we become successful as a business, stopping them? So that's kind of what we're trying to do organizationally, Vectura. So let's switch gears a little bit, right? Kind of how we came together was really through the industry, right? I think I've probably seen you at TAPAs in the past, one or two of those. But some friends of ours brought us together and said, "Hey, this looks like a pretty good match." So, I always appreciate that. And next week is as the first time as a Vectura person, you're going to be going to TAPA and hosting a dinner for law enforcement to appreciate what they do. And tell me a little bit about what you expect to get out of TAPA, or why you're excited to go, and those kind of things.
Sure. I'll tell you, TAPA was my very first experience of moving into the cargo theft unit and seeing that public and private sector partnership. I'm really looking forward to getting back and seeing some of the professionals that I've worked with in the past, who, my contacts who are both in the private sector and public sector. When I was for a large part of my career, the conferences that I attended, they were almost exclusively law enforcement focused, and all the attendees were law enforcement. And I was surrounded by cops and investigators, intelligence people, and that was the attendance. And when I first went into the cargo theft unit, that's when I went to my first TAPA conference, which was in Savannah, Georgia. And it immediately stood out to me, right? It was something that impressed me with, there was such a really great integration between the private sector people and law enforcement. And it was really the first time in my career that I was able to see both sides really operating in a true partnership, focusing on a common mission. So, during my time in my 5-6 years over there, and beyond that, I kept my connections and my contacts. I built a lot of really good relationships, people that I still talk to this day across both sectors, the private and the public. So for me to go back there in this role on the other side of the aisle is really neat. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm never going to leave that law enforcement background. It was such a huge part of my life. So
Sure.
I speak that language. I have that understanding of what those men and women in that field are what they're facing, what they need, what they look like, what their problems are, what their challenges are. And I love to, anytime I could give back to that side of the house, I will. And so I think right now, being in this role, it's a great opportunity for me to stay in that world, bridge both sides together. I could support clients with that background that I have in law enforcement. And, I could also help law enforcement to better understand what the industry's doing, what their practices are, what their risks and their operational realities. So I'm just real excited to do it. And I think that, when we put together that unified team of both sides, the public and the private, that's when things become successful. That's when risk gets mitigated. And then when things do go wrong, that's when we're able to adapt and move very quickly to hopefully get something recovered.
Yeah, no, agreed. That's a really good answer. I think it's going to be a lot of fun at TAPA this year. I'm hoping to, I think the other thing to bring up with that is your willingness to go to things like this and learn in your entire history. There's certain people in life that starve to know more and want to continue to better themselves. And I appreciate the fact that that's who you are. In the little limited time that I've known you, I can really pick up on that piece, right? I'm not satisfied with this knowledge. I want more. I want more. I want more. And I think it's curiosity to me is one of the most important traits in any human being. So I find it, if you're not curious, it seems like your life's going to be pretty boring. But that's just me. That's my soapbox for a minute. To be fair, no, I mean, kind of one last thing to kind of wrap it up. What do you feel like is going to be over the next 3, 6, 9 months? What's the biggest impact you want to have with Vectura, but on the industry as you start to get yourself kind of in a different role and in a very familiar space for you? How do you want to really make that big impact that I know you're going to make?
Well, I think I can help to bridge that gap between law enforcement and the private sector, because both sides speak different languages. Both sides have different connections and contacts. Fortunately for me, I've lived on both sides. I understand how law enforcement operates, how decisions are made, what constraints exist with them, how to help them and how to move them forward. And now being able to work directly with the private sector, I understand what their risks are, what their insights are, what their needs are, and I think I have that ability now to close that gap where when I was on just the one side, you don't have necessarily that ability to bridge that gap. Or if you're strictly sitting on the private sector side, you don't necessarily have that ability to bridge that gap. I think with my connections and my experiences, I can truly bridge that gap and make a difference. Have a really extensive law enforcement network after over 27 years with the state police. I continue to maintain it. I continue to build it. I think you look at what can go wrong for a shipper or a client of ours. You think about what can go wrong, and you look at what the expectations are, what's realistic, what's not realistic, and I think people don't necessarily know what law enforcement can and cannot do. I don't know if they, there's a lot of like things that you see on TV, and you'll hear cops say that all the time. What you see on TV doesn't always, it doesn't happen, right? A lot of that's just made up stuff. So I know the reality of it, the response times, the jurisdictional limitations, evidence thresholds, competing priorities. So being able to know that, I can help set a client's expectations a little bit better, and also work with the law enforcement side to help them with their challenges. So I just think right now it's a time where theft, I don't care if it's cargo theft or any kind of theft or really any criminal enterprise that's operating out there across the country, they are evolving, right? And in many ways, the criminal element, they are evolving faster than law enforcement, faster than private sector entities that are trying to stay ahead of it. So it's our job, people like me, people like you, companies like us, to get into that, to try to identify, what are our threats, how can we mitigate them, and if we can't mitigate them, what do we do once things go bad? And that's really what I'm looking forward to do and being a part of with Vectura.
Yeah, I think I think that's a great explanation. I think you nailed it. Yeah, for me, I think it's going to be an exciting time. Hopefully we won't ever have to use your network, but if we have to, we will, and we'll get there. But I think starting to work to be even more preventative than we are today, keep working on different layers, all the things that you'll help us to grow with and vet out and make sure we're doing, some of the right things and not more of the wrong things. But yeah, it's gonna be a fun ride, and I think it's gonna be very fast and ever changing. It's one of those things. And I also look forward to the opportunity for you to get out with some of your police brethren out there and break bread and give a session to some folks on how we're doing this and educate a little bit. I know the law enforcement world is always looking for a little more information, a little more intel, a little more ways to get after it. So I'm sure our plan for you is to spend a lot of time there, spend a lot of time with carriers and others to train them how drivers need to react and look for things. Because Vectura at its core was built on the idea of bettering the industry, and you're a big part of helping us better the industry. So welcome aboard, Dan. We look forward to working together in the future, and look forward to seeing you next week at TAPA.
Thanks a lot, Bart.
Thanks for the time.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody.